So welcome everybody to part 2 of our discussion on Tolkien's inspirations. And in part 2, we are going to specifically be looking at the friendships and connections that Tolkien made with other people. And this is something that is quite a bit important to his overall worldview and his overall life experience. And while a lot of people seem to feel sometimes in discussions about Tolkien that he might have been a bit of a prickly individual, somebody that wasn't necessarily very outgoing, that is not the case. In fact, he was rather friendly with his friends. It did sort of take him a while to let people into his circle, but once he did, that was a pretty big bonus for him as a person. And if we want to start with his first friend, we'll go back to he and his younger brother Hillary. This is a picture of Ronald and Hillary. Ronald's here on the left, and Hillary is on the right. And their friendship is one that is going to be lifelong. You know that many times families don't always necessarily see eye to eye. We all probably have family members that we don't get along with super duper well. But Ronald and Hillary's relationship was always one of mutual respect. And while they did, occasionally have what we might call brotherly squabbles or things like that, they were on good talking terms with each other for their entire life. And especially after Ronald's mother died, Hillary is going to be what we can really say is his closest family member, and that is going to be a really strong relationship. Now, Ronald does also get in some time with his cousins, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in part 4. They're quite influential to his life as well. And of course, he has aunts and uncles that are going to be part of his family, but his relationship with Hillary was very, very close. And they shared a lot of adventures, and a lot of the earliest memories that Ronald had are going to relate to times that he spent with his brother, especially as a young boy, going on adventures around the region that they lived, wandering around in the woods, just walking across fields, getting in minor mischief, that sort of stuff. These are things that he's going to look back very fondly at over the course of his life, and we'll come back to Hillary later on. Now, one of the figures that steps into Ronald's life upon the death of his mother is Father Francis. This is Francis Morgan. He was a priest at the Birmingham Oratory, the Catholic church in Birmingham, where Ronald's mother had basically brought up the boys. And he is going to be designated as their guardian until they turn 21. And while Father Morgan himself was rather strict and direct, he was also a very caring individual, and he does seem to have the boys' best interest at heart. And he was also one of the first people, other than his mother, to really start encouraging Ronald to sort of break out of his shell a little bit. And this is going to be accomplished mostly by Father Francis allowing Ronald into his library. Now, this is something that had always been a love going all the way back to his earliest memories. Ronald always loved reading, and Father Francis was Spanish and spoke Spanish, and Ronald had this interest in learning other languages. He had already been tutored in French and Latin from his mother, but there are going to be some books that were primers for the Spanish language that were in Father Francis's library, and Father Francis encourages Ronald to start reading and studying and learning other languages as well. And this is actually going to be something that is going to start a lifelong passion with language. or not maybe start, but continue a lifelong love of language. Now, Father Francis himself also represents this caring figure, and even the physical features of Father Francis are going to start showing up again later on when Ronald starts writing. One of the most telltale signs of this might be that Father Francis smoked a pipe, and Ronald, as a young boy, remembered that quite fondly, that Father Francis would smoke a pipe and read a book or tell a story or give some sort of discussion or lesson to the boys. And this idea of a strong paternal figure that is very wise, that knows the world, that has traveled, that smokes a pipe, you can see how this might influence later figures, especially might go into something like a Gandalf figure that shows up in his writings later on. So Father Francis is also going to be responsible for one of the earliest trips that Ronald took. We mentioned this in part 1, but again, this particular trip was out to what's known as the Lizard Coast. This is in the one of the far southwestern peninsulas of Britain, and Ronald was struck by this particular location for many different reasons. This was, again, one of the first times that he had ever really traveled. This was going to be one of the first times that he had a working memory of the sea. Of course, he showed up very early on to England via boat from South Africa, but he was very young at that point and had very, very few memories of the sea. But this is going to be something that's impactful, and he's going to return many times to the seaside here, and Father Francis bringing him around and discussing things about nature and its relationship with religion and its relationship with history are going to be things that are going to impact a young Ronald quite a bit. So when Ronald gets into school, this is actually going to be a period of time where you might think, oh, well, he'll just make a lot of friends that are his age. And it does seem like he had some friends in the earliest years of school that were pretty important to him, but it's not really going to be until he gets a few years on that he starts making friends that are around his age. And partially because of his situation, he was much more comfortable in many cases speaking with adults. And this probably comes from the fact that he had been, raised with his brother, and they lived out in the country for quite some time, and a lot of the other children, would be acquaintances in the region, but not necessarily close friends that he would go out on adventures with. That place was sort of filled readily by his little brother. And then, of course, after his mother died, he spent a lot of time in the oratory, in the church, physically in the church, and was around priests and people that were significantly older than he. And this is not necessarily something that is to be expected in a lot of different scenarios if you are having what we might call a normal childhood. But Ronald's particular belief is one that's a little bit different, right? He feels a little bit older than he actually is. And when he goes to school, one of the figures that's going to be particularly important to him is the seated gentleman right here. This is Robert Carey Gilson. Gilson is going to be one of the first teachers that recognizes Ronald's love of language. And in fact, right here, we actually have a young Ronald at school. This would be at his earliest school at King Edward's. So Gilson is a person that was teaching mostly English and literature, but he recognizes right away that Ronald is just sort of fascinated by this concept of language. And it's going to be Gilson that basically exposes Tolkien to the concept of philology. So this is, again, the study of words and language, and he's going to really push Ronald towards the idea of looking at how words interact with each other and looking at the history of words and things of that nature. And that's going to be very, very important. Another one of his teachers, and one that is just as influential, is a gentleman named George Brewerton. And Brewerton was mostly going to be, again, in the literature and language arts areas, but he was originally the first person that really introduced Ronald to Shakespeare. And there's an interesting letter where later in his life, Ronald says that he disliked cordially the works of Shakespeare. And that has been taken a bit out of context to sort of say that he didn't like Shakespeare at all, or that he was just trying to be polite. What we can interpret from this particular quote here is that Tolkien had already understood that his love was for the older English language. And in fact, it's Brewerton who is going to first expose Ronald to older versions of English. And one of the things that Brewerton did in his class was read the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. So Middle English, of course, is one that a person that speaks modern English could sort of cipher out in most situations. It's not as far separated as the Anglo-Saxon Old English. But even hearing these words in an older form is going to really light a fire under our topic here, Tolkien. And when Brewerton figures out that this Middle English exposure to Chaucer was going to be so important, one of the things that he allows Robert to do, Ronald to do, is borrow some Anglo-Saxon grammar books. So these would be your earliest I want to learn Anglo-Saxon or I want to learn Old English books. And it's sort of this interesting moment where, Ronald speaks with his teacher and tells him that he really loves this material so much, and he goes, well, wait, there's more, right? If you like this stuff, you should see the older version of stuff. And it's this moment where Ronald immediately falls in love. And coming out of these early experiences with his teachers, he's going to develop this appreciation for the depth of language. And that's something that is going to stay with him for the rest of his life. And it's actually going to be one of the most influential parts of his entire career. Not just his writing career that we're also familiar with, but his academic career, but also his worldview. This idea that the words that we speak tell stories of things that came before us. This idea that even the way that we explain things with our language is predicated on these cultural influences that stretch back for thousands of years sometimes. And this concept of a depth of language is really, really, really formative for Ronald. And this is stuff that he's getting at a very young age. At this point, he would be 13 or 14 years old. And he's already sort of devouring whatever he can put his hands on when it comes to these different languages. So this is a really, really big impact. Now, another big impact on his young life, of course, is Edith Bratt. They're going to meet in 1908, and they were both lodgers at a boarding house that was run by a lady named Miss Faulkner. And it did not take very long for them to basically decide that they were in love with each other. And Edith was going to be one of the people that really understood Tolkien for who he was almost right off the bat. And that's something special. A lot of people, again, when they first met Tolkien, they thought that he might be sort of a polite old man, but a bit standoffish perhaps, or that he might be a bit overbearing and a bit sort of a stick in the mud, perhaps a stickler for the rules. But he and Edith had that chemistry, and it was evident from a very early age. Now, this is also going to be one of the first times where Ronald's family and his friends are going to kind of have a moment of turmoil, perhaps is a good word for it. Because when Father Francis finds out that Ronald and Edith are in love, Father Francis decides that he needs to step in and forbid them seeing each other. And one of the biggest reasons for this was that Edith was not Catholic, and also Father Francis was worried that being involved with a girl would distract from Ronald's studies. And at that time, Ronald was getting to the point where he was getting through school and was not too terribly far away from starting to apply to universities. And at that point, of course, you need to be on your studies. You need to make sure that you're finishing your work and getting things done and in on time and all of these things. But it was actually another group that is going to dominate most of Ronald's time during this period. There's some back and forth, but eventually Ronald does basically tell Edith that he can't see her anymore. We will talk about that again in section 4 of our discussion. But we do need to talk a little bit about a group that is going to be incredibly important to him in his early years. The Tea Club, or the Barovian Society, and frequently they will refer to themselves as the TCBSs. And the TCBSs are a group of students at King Edward's that become very fast friends. And originally there are 3 of them: Christopher Wiseman, Robert Q. Gilson, who was the son of Carrie Gilson, the influential teacher, and Tolkien, the original 3. And then later they're going to add another younger member, that's Geoffrey Bosch Smith, who they refer to as GBS. Now, there are others that are going to be what we might call satellite members, but these 4 are going to be the core of the TCBSs. First off, why are they even called this in the first place? Well, the Tea Club came from some illicit meetings in the library where they would sneak in tea to the library where they weren't supposed to be having it and discuss literature, poetry, etc., while skirting the rules in a mischievous but not ultimately threatening sort of way, right? They never really did anything that was completely going to be damaging, but they were above and beyond the rules. But part of this is because they very much saw themselves as a little bit better. And this is something that, absolutely fits with Tolkien's character, because they're going to end up having these grand ideas for themselves, and they're going to consider themselves the future of English writing. And they're later going to move to a tea house when the library gets a little bit crowded. This particular tea house is the Barrowstones Tea House, which is just around the corner from the school. So the Barovian Society comes from Barrowstones Tea House. But they will refer to themselves as TCBSites or TCBSs, and this stands for Tea Club Barovian Society. I do have one picture. It's a little bit difficult to find photographs of these young men at that particular age, but here we do see several of them. Christopher Wiseman here. He and Tolkien were actually the closest of the 2 members. They referred to themselves somewhat separate from the group. What's interesting here is that Wiseman was one of the few people that Ronald spoke about religion with. And Catholicism was not necessarily out of place in England at the time, but it also was not necessarily the vogue. And while Wiseman was not a Catholic, Tolkien very much was, and they were able to discuss theology and have disagreements about things and yet still be friends. And this was something that Tolkien treasured quite a bit. So here we have GBS again, Geoffrey Bosch Smith. He is the younger of the four, and Rob Gilson. Again, these are going to form sort of the four core members of the TCBSs. Now, this might just seem like a group of guys sitting around reading poetry and reading literature and maybe putting on airs, being a little bit big for their britches. But this group is actually going to form what I would consider to be familial bonds. They refer to themselves as brothers. This really does seem to fill a void that Tolkien has in a fraternal sort of way. And it's always very interesting to me that Hilary, while going to King Edward's, was not in the TCBSites, but that's perhaps a topic for another discussion. But one of the things that they're going to do for Ronald, and one of the things that they're going to represent for Ronald, is that they're going to introduce him to things that he would not normally have sought after. By this point in late grade school, he had already very deeply devoted himself to the older English writings. And especially Smith is going to encourage Ronald very strongly to start reading poetry, which is not something that Ronald particularly cared for very much. And he especially didn't like modern poetry. He thought that it was all a bit frilly, and what he preferred was older stuff. But, you know, Smith's going to point out that a lot of the older Anglo-Saxon works were actually written in verse, and he gets Tolkien to start writing poetry. Now, originally, the stuff that Tolkien's going to write is a bit silly. One of the things that he writes is a poem that describes a rugby match that happened at the school. Ronald played rugby, and it casts the entire match as this great battle between two armies. And things like this are what we might expect from young people getting into poetry, but this is actually going to turn into something that Ronald really finds a lot of love in. And he probably would not have taken poetry as seriously as soon as he did if it weren't for the influences from the people in the TCBSs. Now, what's really unfortunate for the group is that when they got to university, they're not all going to get into the same university. Wiseman and Gilson are going to go off to Cambridge, where Tolkien and Smith are going to end up at Oxford. And you might think, okay, well, that's the end of the TCBSs, but in fact, no. They made points to continue to send each other letters. They would very frequently send each other bits of stuff that they have written, especially poetry or lyrics, some short story work, but mostly they would send poetry back and forth to each other to get remarks and encouragement. And they would meet up on holidays, and they would try to make a point to all get together and maybe perform a play, or just even sit around all night long and talk about literature and how they were going to change the world. And these four are going to be very, very important to Tolkien. They're going to form a core of his early life, and they're going to be sort of the foundation of his young adult world. Picking back up, when Tolkien gets to Oxford in 1911, his first year is 1911, 19 to 12, he still has the desire to have a group of friends. And while the TCBSs are going to be in constant contact with each other through letters, it's not the same as being able to meet with them in person. And one of the things that Tolkien's going to try to do while he's at Oxford is try to catch some of that lightning in a bottle once again. And in 1912, he and another student are going to form a group called the Apolostics. And this was a group devoted to self-indulgence. And this is as close as Tolkien ever got to really being a rascal. They would stay up very late. They might make a lot of noise. They might ride their bikes down the road whilst yelling or singing quite loudly at very small hours of the morning. But the Apolostics were going to be, again, an attempt at recreating the TCBSs. And one of the friends that Tolkien was going to share a lot of his time with is this gentleman here, who is named Charles Cullis. Now, Cullis is going to be another student that was very, very interested in poetry. And while Tolkien, again, was not necessarily the world's biggest poetry fan, Cullis and Tolkien are going to discuss quite a bit the work of this gentleman. This is Francis Thompson. And Francis Thompson was a British poet who lived from 1859 to 1907. And Thompson notably was Catholic. There is actually quite a bit of influence that Thompson's work has on Tolkien's own poetry, specifically with the use of rhyme schemes and organization. Thompson is a very complex poet who sometimes wrote verses that were very, very basic or simple, and sometimes were very, very complex. And this contrast to Tolkien is going to be something of a revelation, where he looks at simple, basic poetry and complex poetry and sees them as instruments in the same symphony. You know, some instruments get the good parts that play loudly and everybody gets to hear them be the solo, but other parts might be less technically skilled but are equally as important to the overall production value. And this concept is going to be one that sticks with Tolkien. And if you read, especially Lord of the Rings, you might find that he mimics this quite well when he has, for example, Sam makes up some poetry, and Sam's poetry is all what we might call fairly basic. It's straight rhyme where every other line rhymes with each other, but you'll also see these really in-depth, what we might call complicated or complex poetry, where you have internal rhyme scheme and the meter and the beats matter. And Tolkien became very aware during this time that they were both tools that could be used to serve different purposes. And that's fairly interesting to me, because one of the things that Tolkien starts doing a lot around this time is becoming very much more active when it comes to writing poetry. Now, also around this time, Tolkien is going to turn 21. And 21 ended his time of being under the care of Father Francis Morgan. And it also marked the point where Father Francis said that it was okay for Tolkien to continue his relationship with Edith. And the day that he turned 21, he wrote her a letter and basically said, I'm back. I still love you. I'd love to get married to you. I hope that you're doing well. I know that we haven't talked in quite some time, but here I am. And what's really interesting here is that she writes him back and says, Ronald, I'm sorry. I'm already engaged. I thought you had moved on. I thought you had, given up on me and had given up on the relationship. And Tolkien gets on a train the next day and rides to meet her and convinces her that she needs to break off the engagement with the other gentleman and marry him. And this is a sort of a fateful moment where he could have lost what was the love of his life, but he didn't, and fate worked out the right way, and everything was kind of good in the end. Now, Edith did convert to Catholicism in 1914, and this is what's going to finally be the sort of blessing of Father Francis, because even though Tolkien was obviously interested in marrying her, he really did want Father Francis's blessing. And this is a large part, again, because of how important Father Francis had been in his life. And we talked a lot in part one, especially about how poor Tolkien's family was growing up. And it wasn't just the friendship and the guidance and the fatherly figure that Father Francis represented. It was also the financial support. He couldn't, Ronald couldn't very well betray the gentleman that was effectively putting him through college sometimes, right? And he really wanted Father Francis's approval. So when the conversion happened and Edith is going to sort of gain the approval of Father Francis, this is amazing for Tolkien, because this was his sort of dream come true. But he was still in college, and he was very clear that he needed to finish college. This is something that was a leftover from being involved in the poverty situation. He wanted to make sure that he had a way to pay for everything. He wanted to be able to take care of Edith, and we talked about that extensively in part one, so we'll sort of reference that, but move on. But he was still at college, right? So he still had a little bit of time, and he still needed to finish his work and turn in papers and do all of these things. And he also still wanted friends. And he and Cullis are going to go on to found another club that was called the Checkers Club. And this was a dining society. And one of the things that was very popular for young students to do was to have these big meals where they would sort of feast each other and bring you to a place where everybody would sit down and we'd have a good conversation. And the Checkers Club was, again, another one of these attempts at forming these groups of camaraderie. And they made these very elaborate menus and these very elaborate invitations to all these Checkers Clubs meetings, and they would perform them as if they were sort of functions of state, and they all had individual positions and ranks within the Checkers Club. And it was a fun little exercise that he and Cullis shared together. Cullis was the second president after Tolkien left. But this is founded in 1914, and one of the other things that happened in 1914, of course, was the beginning of World War I. And this is going to be a tough time for Tolkien. So Wiseman ends up signing up for the Navy. Gilson and Smith, the other two members of the TCBSs, are both going to sign up for the Army. And GBS, Geoffrey Smith, is going to be in a group called the Lancashire Fusiliers. And Tolkien initially resisted signing up for any sort of military service because, again, he really felt this desire to finish his degree. And he's going to start by signing up for what's basically volunteer officer training school. And he didn't care for that very much. But when Smith ends up getting fully invested into the Army, he's going to write back to Tolkien that he is fairly certain that his commanding officer could have a spot for Tolkien if Tolkien was going to be a lower level officer. And this is something that sort of gives him some heart because, if you could end up in the same military unit as one of your best friends, this was, of course, a way to try to make the war less grim. Now, Cullis was not going to be able to sign up for the military at all. Cullis was actually rather uh, ill-healthed at the moment. He had quite a bit of problems physically, and he's never going to be able to get a clean bill of health to sign up for the military. So Cullis does get to stay behind with Tolkien, and this is some level of, I guess, support or perhaps camaraderie. They're actually going to end up moving in together to get out of the dorm situation. Tolkien was very aware as the dorm started emptying out that he was one of the boys that wasn't going off to fight. And that really weighed fairly heavily on him, especially knowing that all of his other friends had signed up to fight. It's also fair to point out that Smith and Gilson and Weissman were all from families that had financial means, and if they didn't finish university, they could still have a fairly good shot at getting some sort of job after the war, just because of their family connections, or some sort of, loan to start a business or something of this nature could come from their particular familial situations. But Tolkien didn't have that, right? At this point, Tolkien was a young adult with himself to take care of. So one of the last big TCBS meetings is on Christmas break in 1914. And they're going to go to Wiseman's house in London. And this was sort of looked at as, well, they refer to it as the Council of London. This was their, we know that things are about to happen and we don't know how much we're going to get to see of each other anymore meeting. And they really sort of milked as much out of it as they possibly could. They discussed how they wanted to change the world. They discussed how they were going to play roles in the future evolution of English literature. And they focused a lot on poetry that they had written. They all read stuff that they had written and exchanged notes on those things. This meeting at Christmas in 1914 was a big one. It was a big one. Now, Tolkien did continue for a couple of years, finished his degree. We'll talk more about that in part 3. But he does end up getting into the Lancashire Fusiliers with Smith, but he's not in the same regiment. He ends up in the same group, but not necessarily in the same unit. So that was a bit of a letdown for him. The last big thing that's going to happen for Ronald before he ends up going to war is that he's finally going to get to marry Edith. And they get married on March 22nd of 1916, and they are going to go on honeymoon, and then Ronald, by June, will be in France. So June the 4th, 1916, Ronald gets sent to France. He gets placed in the 11th Battalion, which is not what GBS was in. And again, this is not something that Tolkien particularly enjoyed. He was an officer, but he was not a moneyed person. He was not the officer that you would think of. He does get a Batman, which is basically a personal aide. And if you know anything about Tolkien, you're probably going to know that the concept of a Batman is going to be directly related to Sam and Frodo. So Sam is Frodo's aide, helper, servant, gardener, right? But the same sort of thing that Sam would do for Frodo in the stories are what Tolkien's Batman would do for him. And he actually liked quite a few of them and got along with them more than he did the officers. But he wasn't supposed to necessarily mix a lot with the regular soldiers because that was just not the way that it worked. There are going to be a couple of instances where GBS and Tolkien are actually going to run into each other during the war. And this is going to be brief reprieves where they're both off duty behind the lines. And what's really interesting is when they see each other, they sit down and they drink tea and they talk about poetry. And They exchange letters from the other members of the TCBSs, and they sort of do their best to pretend that they're not in the middle of the biggest war that the world had ever seen to that point. And Tolkien remembered this period of time very, very vividly, and specifically what he called the animal horror of war. And this was not just because he was separated from his family and his friends, but this is also just, what World War I was. It was a pretty horrible period of time, and he was on the front lines. He was active during the Battle of the Somme, which, if you know anything about the Battle of the Somme, was one of the more deadly strings of battles that existed in World War I. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives at this battle, and he was there for months on the front lines and spent times in the trenches, in the front lines, but still tried to do whatever he could to exchange letters and send word back. But on a fateful day, somewhere around July 17th of 1916, Tolkien gets a letter from Smith that lets him know that their friend and fellow TCBSite Gilson was killed on July the 1st, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Gilson was part of a unit that had been scheduled to charge across no man's land right at the beginning of the battle, and he was struck by an artillery shell and basically blown to bits. And this is going to shake Tolkien's world. At one point, he writes a letter to Smith and Wiseman that basically says that something inside of him had broken. Something had gone crack, and he just didn't know how to view the world anymore. And it's pretty evident when you read his work that when characters die, you can really feel that loss. If you've read Lord of the Rings, in the first chapter of Two Towers, Aragorn finds Boromir's body, and Boromir, of course, records that he had, trying to take the ring from Frodo, but Aragorn, forgives him, tells him to hush, and then it says that he bends over his body and weeps, right? And this is Aragorn. He's supposed to be like the manliest man ever, right? And we see this many other times when Merry is mourning the death of Theoden. He says, I don't know if I'm going to smoke anymore. And he's, talking to the fellowship, and he's like, I never got to sit with Theoden and smoke anymore. And I don't think I'm going to do that. And then he gets told, no, what you need to do is smoke and think about him. So this feeling of loss is something that Tolkien felt very real in his life. And, this is not just the loss of a parent. He had already lost two of those. But this is the loss of a brother and a friend and somebody that's a part of your world that is almost irreplaceable, right? It's not too long after this, in October of 1916, that Tolkien was diagnosed with pyrexia, which is a infection that gets into your circulatory system that causes your fever to spike really, really bad, and you get it from lice. So this is, of course, a very common thing in the trenches in World War I, and he was initially brought back to a field hospital for officers, and he stayed there for a little while, and when he didn't recover, he gets sent to England again. And by November the 8th of 1916, he is back on the shores of England, and he gets put up in a hospital and is in the process of convalescing, but he has a really hard go of this, and the temperature comes back randomly. He'll have periods of time where he might go 2 weeks and feel okay, and they'll move him to active duty, and he'll start going through drills again. and he gets immediately sick, and they have to put him right back in hospital. And while some of his friends, like Wiseman and Smith and Edith, all say this is actually not so bad, right? Because you're not in the mix. He sort of feels guilty that his unit is still over there, that his friends are still fighting, that he's now being left out of it. And he gets another letter from Wiseman on right around the first week of December of 1916 that lets Tolkien know that Smith had also been killed on December the 3rd of 1916. And at this point, the only two of the TCBSs left were Wiseman and Tolkien, and this really pushes Ronald to try to take on sort of the mantle, right? Because the TCBSs were going to change the world. They were going to reshape the scape of literature. And now there are only two of them left, and Wiseman, while being an important part of the group, was even personally, admittedly, not as good of a writer as Tolkien was. And Tolkien sort of sees this as his calling, right? Like, he now has to carry the burden, and he now has to sort of fulfill the role of being the writer. And even while he's in hospital, he starts working on what he called the Book of Lost Tales. And the Book of Lost Tales is going to include quite a few snippets of poetry, but also several stories. And we know those stories in a more full version because the Book of Lost Tales will one day go on to be published as the Silmarillion. And he starts this as a direct response to losing two of the most important friends that he has in his life. And this is going to be a monumentally impactful moment for him. 1918 is going to come not too long, but for the majority of 1917 and the vast majority of 1918, Tolkien is still in the army. And he gets moved around quite frequently because he will be back and forth into hospital, and he'll also be posted at various military areas inside of England. He gets put in some forts on the coastline. He, for a brief period of time, gets stuck training signal officers. He ended up basically never being fully brought back to active duty because of the fever. And this is unfortunately going to put a lot of stress on Edith, because as Tolkien ends up moving around all of these times, Edith is going to have a question about whether or not she is going to follow. And by this time in 1917, they've got a son, because at this point their first son had been born. So how do you constantly move around back and forth, up and down the coastline, across the country, up and down the length of the island? It's very, very difficult. And eventually Edith sort of picks a location and says, I'm not moving anymore. And while they recognize that this is the product of circumstances outside of their control to a large extent, it really does still put a bit of a strain on the marriage, especially because Edith was, trying to raise kids, and she had support from her family, especially one of her cousins that she lived with fairly frequently, but it's not something that's easy for her. And especially because she wasn't really able to keep a steady job. And one of the things that she had always wanted to do was play piano. And moving a piano every 3 or 4 months across the country of England is not something that is feasible. And so they, didn't have a piano. In many instances, she didn't even have one that she could play at all. Sometimes she borrowed pianos from churches, not, borrowed them, but went to the churches to play. Other times they found locations that did have them, but she was not very happy during this period of time. And it does appear that Tolkien understood this, but he also didn't necessarily know how to handle that. he didn't really know what he could do because, again, he was still in the army. He couldn't just leave or couldn't just quit. But he's going to end up getting a couple of jobs. So the war, of course, ends in November of 1918. He's going to spend a brief period of time working at the dictionary, or working with the dictionary group, but he's going to end up moving to Leeds. And while he's at Leeds, he's going to make another one of these connections for a new friend. This is E.V. Gordon. E.V. Gordon was a medieval German philologist, and he was actually a Canadian, but he is going to show up in 1922, right around the same time that Tolkien got the job at Leeds, and they're going to strike up a big friendship very, very quickly, because they are both going to find a common ground with the love of words. While Tolkien was at Leeds, he was teaching Welsh, which is a language that he had a connection to from living back at a location called King's Heath. He had been interested in the Welsh language for quite some time. This is the first time that he actually is going to be able to teach it, but he's also going to be able to teach Old English. And even though he and E.V. Gordon are going to have a very good friendship, and they're going to strike up quite a bit of conversation between each other, the issue with Edith is always going to be present here. By the time Tolkien is working at Leeds, they will have all four of their children. And Edith is not necessarily happy living in the house that was provided by the university. It was very small. It was very uncomfortable. There was not a lot of room for 2 adults and 4 children. But she also was tired of moving around all of the time. And when Tolkien was in this period of time, his production of writing dropped significantly, because he felt like he owed it to his family to try to do whatever he could for them, but he also didn't necessarily have an overwhelmingly large amount of money to just make all the situation go away, and he didn't write a lot. But what he did find joy in was spending those times with his family and trying to make do with what he had. And he's going to start another club. So this is the first time he's going to be on the academic side of things from a teacher's perspective, but he and Gordon are going to start something at Leeds called the Viking Club. And the Viking Club was originally designed to try to get students that were at the University of Leeds to get interested in the English program. When Tolkien first started at Leeds, the program was very, very small, but through things like this club, the numbers actually grew fairly rapidly. And this club specifically was designed to encourage people to read, especially the Old Norse sagas. And this would be a time where students would meet together and they would have food and usually drink. At that time, it was perfectly okay for students and teachers to have a drink together, something that would be anathema in the States today. But getting involved in the Viking Club is going to sort of spark something in Tolkien again, and this is going to be very influential in getting him back into writing, specifically working with the Old Norse language. And Old Norse is going to go on to be the basis of one of his elven languages. So if you're familiar with the High Elf language, what's called Quenya, it's actually based on Finnish, which is one of these Scandinavian languages that Tolkien loved so much. So, of course, Finnish and Old Norse are not the same, but these Viking Club readings where Tolkien would translate something from a saga or from the Kalevala and come in and read it in the original language, this kind of rekindled his love even though the family situation was a bit rough. Now, things go very well for Tolkien. His work at Leeds drew a lot of attention, and he is going to end up getting a job in Oxford. And he moves in on May 11th, 1926. He goes to the first meeting of the English faculty. Now, what's interesting here is that the family, including all of the kids and Edith, were still in Leeds, but Tolkien had to move to start teaching at Oxford, and it's going to put a strain on this relationship. He's also leaving Gordon behind, and they had worked to publish some translations together, so they had already been involved in academic work together, and leaving Gordon is going to be tough for him. But when he makes his way to Oxford, he's going to run into this gentleman. This gentleman is Clive Staples Lewis, or C.S. Lewis as he's known as a writer, but to his friends, he was always known as Jack. And Lewis and Tolkien are going to sort of recognize that they are kindred spirits very early on. And Lewis is going to sort of fill the role that Tolkien needed, the friendship role, the push to write and to produce. And he's also going to be the basis for some of the stuff that happens in the story. Lewis had a rather loud, booming voice, and very frequently would use this as a way to kind of grumble. He would kind of harumph and make loud noises to get everybody's attention, and then use the attention to give a good diatribe or a burn or something like that. But this loud booming voice and this kind of grumpiness is actually something that influences Tolkien. So if you've ever read Lord of the Rings and you know how Treebeard talks, Treebeard and his voice and the cadence that he speaks in and the way that he makes these big noises like hroom hroom, this is directly based on how Lewis talked. So even being around these people is going to feed into the larger sort of pool of ideas that Tolkien is going to pull from to make his world. Now, the two of them are going to be at different colleges, but they were both at Oxford, and this means that they were around each other quite a bit. And when Tolkien gets to Oxford, he is really going to be interested in trying to get a new focus on Old Norse in the curriculum. And this is something that he had done successfully up at Leeds, but Leeds is different than Oxford. And when Tolkien shows up as the new professor and says, I think we need to teach Old Norse and we need to bring in Icelandic sagas, and these are the things that everybody needs to get enthusiastic about, he's not really met with a lot of positive response. He sort of gets told, you're the newbie, be quiet. And so what is he going to do? Well, he forms a new club. And this particular club is called the Coal Biters Club, where he's going to get people together and they're going to read the Icelandic sagas. But specifically, they're going to read them in Old Norse. And he convinces Lewis a little bit through persuasion that Lewis should show up. And he does this to increase students and faculty members' awareness of the language. And this is actually going to be an early version of Tolkien kind of using this idea of friendship to influence the way that other people are going to approach him academically speaking, because he does actually end up eventually getting the curriculum changed with Lewis's help. Now, by the time we get to 1931, there's going to be a big shift. And this is going to start with this gentleman here. This gentleman is first name is Edward, but he goes by his middle name, Tangia Lean. And Professor Lean was at Oxford, and specifically, he was a writer, and he had written quite a bit of critique. So he did stuff like book reviews and things of that nature. And in 1931, he is going to found a group called the Inklings. And if you are familiar with the story, you probably know where this is going, but you might not have actually known that this wasn't something that Tolkien founded himself. In fact, Lean was not necessarily interested in doing the same sort of stuff that Lewis and Tolkien ended up doing later on. And to be fair, Lean was much more friendly with Lewis than he was Tolkien. Now, Tolkien still went to the meetings of the early Inklings, and of course he was still going to read his material and things of this nature. But this is not really the incarnation of the Inklings that you might be thinking of that happens a little bit later. That's going to happen after some fairly significant changes. Now, one of the people that also participated in this original version of the Inklings was a gentleman named Hugo Dyson. You can see him here seated next to Tolkien. This is, of course, much later on. I believe this photograph comes from the later 50s, so this is probably a good 20 years after the time period that we're discussing. But I thought this was a good picture because I would be able to talk about the fact that these two gentlemen were friends for decades. Now, Dyson was an interesting figure because he was a professor of English, but he much preferred the modern English track as opposed to the older English track. So he was a big fan of Shakespeare, and also the writer of the Enlightenment, Alexander Pope. If you're familiar with any of Pope's poetries or writings, Dyson was a big fan of him as well. But what's interesting from this relationship is that Lewis and Tolkien got along very well, but there was a big difference, and there was a big standout thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in part 4, but a particular discussion between Tolkien, Dyson, and Lewis is going to be instrumental in Lewis converting to Christianity. And this is a big deal for Tolkien because he had always been a little bit, uncomfortable with the concept that Lewis was such an outspoken and averred atheist. So, it didn't necessarily sit well, but again, with friends, you find a way. And we'll talk about that again in part 4 quite a bit. But in around this period of time, Tolkien had been working on some stories that he had shared with his kids, and he's going to show the first chapters of a book called The Hobbit to his friend Jack Lewis. And what's really interesting here is it's fairly evident from all of the information that we have that what Lewis was doing, what Tolkien was doing here is asking Jack, is this even worth finishing? And this is something that is part of Tolkien's larger identity, and this is especially something that we'll talk about in the 4th installment of our series. But there's always a certain amount of doubt about whether or not something was quite right or quite good enough. And if you were with us in part 1, or if you catch this on a replay, you'll remember that the first thing Tolkien ever wrote got a little bit of critique from his mom, and then he stopped writing for years. So him sharing the early chapters of The Hobbit with Lewis was a big step. But this is also a sign that he and Lewis had become rather fast friends, and that he appreciated Lewis's response. And it's fair to say here that if Lewis had given a negative review, the trajectory of Tolkien's life might have been completely different. If Lewis had not known him well enough to understand the right way to respond to this request, that might not have ever turned into The Hobbit, which would, of course, then not turned into Lord of the Rings, which would not have turned into any of the stuff that we have after this period of time. Now, Tolkien had published, before this, he had published quite a few poems and had done some lectures that had gotten quite a bit of traction. But this is a pivotal moment. This is where Tolkien sort of ends up moving towards, I can probably write long-form fiction. And it's an important one. And he shared that with his friend. What about the Inklings proper? What about the big group that we all sort of know about? Lean is going to end up... So Tangia Lean is going to end up leaving Oxford. And in 1933, Lewis is going to sort of inherit the title. Again, Lean was always more of a friend with Lewis than he was Tolkien. And Lewis decides that they need to move the meetings and they need to change the membership and they need to give the Inklings a little bit of a renovation, right? A little bit of spring cleaning. And there are going to be several new members that start joining. For example, this gentleman, this is Warnie Lewis. His given name is Warren, but goes by Warnie. This is C.S. Lewis's brother, and he was a historian, specifically a French military historian. He had been in the military for quite some time and had written extensively on military history. And if you were with us in the first installment, you might remember that Tolkien was not necessarily the world's largest fan of French as a language. Yet here he is going to be very friendly with Warnie Lewis, who is a French military historian. That always sort of sits interesting with me. And they have complementary but somewhat different approaches to things. Warnie Lewis, if anything, was more boisterous than his brother, and definitely was rather opinionated and outspoken. So the fact that they got along quite well was interesting. Another one of the original Inklings, and perhaps one of the more important ones that a lot of people don't talk about very much, is this gentleman. This is Owen Barfield. Barfield was originally a philosopher. Now, he had written some poetry and was very, very well read, but the reflections that Tolkien has in later years about his relationship with Barfield is going to be a very interesting set of anecdotes. And from what we can gather, Barfield actually had a very big impact on how Tolkien viewed the world. Specifically, one of the areas that Barfield was interested in philosophically was the concept of nature. And he had read a lot on Plato and a lot of the old classical philosophy stuff. But one of the things that's going to come out of their discussions, they being Barfield and Tolkien, is this concept that for a person to be what we might consider happy or fulfilled, one of the ways to do that is to sort of unify with nature, that our thinking should be as natural as possible and our actions should be as natural as possible. And we see this stuff sort of pop up in Tolkien's literature in people like Tom Bombadil, right? Tom Bombadil is obviously a being of some level of miraculous power. The One Ring, this most powerful evil artifact, has no effect or no power over Bombadil. And Bombadil lives in this very small, idyllic setting where he is the master of his domain, and he is ultimately just as happy as a lark, right? Every time you see Bombadil, he's singing, he's dancing around, he's throwing his hat up in the air. He and Goldberry live this wonderful life, And this kind of characterization where Bombadil's sort of part of the natural setting, that's an idea that we can attribute to the influence of Barfield on Tolkien's life, right? We can see how the elves, who were much more attuned with the natural world, are going to have what a lot of people call magic, right? The scene of the Mirror of Galadriel, where Sam says, "I'd really like to see some elven magic," and Galadriel fills this basin up with water, and she says, "I don't really get what you mean when you say magic, but this is probably it. I can make this show you stuff." That's because Galadriel has a much more personal relationship with things of the earth, because elves are just more attuned with the earth. And this is something that would have jived very well with Barfield's philosophy. This idea that harmony with the natural world is something that can lead to happiness, and this has a big effect on Tolkien. We have multiple references where he refers to Barfield in very positive manners. One other of the important Inklings is this gentleman here. This is R.E. Howard. You can see him sitting next to an older Lewis. Havard is actually an interesting addition to the group. He was a doctor, and he didn't have a degree in any sort of literature. He didn't even necessarily write that much when it came to producing works of fiction, but he really liked myths, and especially he liked mythology and the concept of lore, and a lot of the things that the Inklings would sort of pass around were, of course, very much based on things like lore and mythology. And so they had a lot of common ground, even though he was a doctor. Now, what's interesting is a lot of the members of the Inklings end up getting nicknames. Havard's nickname is actually Useless Quack. This is from a description where Warnie Lewis had called him a useless quack. So, of course, this was just in jest. It wasn't an insult. But Havard would go on to be referred to as UQ quite a bit, and rather embraced it. And at one point, they even one of the members forgot his first name and called him Humphrey instead of Robert, and they sort of took up calling him Humphrey for a bit. Tolkien's nickname, I mentioned this earlier, was Tollers, which was something that they ended up just sort of running with, and Jack, of course, instead of Clive, that sort of thing. So the Inklings, of course, were very, very important and a very, very big deal for him. So before we go on with sort of what ended up happening with this, so why were the Inklings so important? What was their role, and why do we care so much about them? Well, obviously, if Tolkien was a guy that just always wanted this group of friends around him, and he needed these sounding boards, and he needed these people to give him the right amount of inspiration and the right amount of push to complete things in such a... this was the group that he wanted, and this is the group that really sort of came to him. And they fell very quickly into a rather comfortable routine. But this was their fort. This is the Eagle and Child pub, where for years, Tuesday mornings, you would find the Inklings sitting around a table and having a good chat. In true Inklings fashion, they stopped calling it the Eagle and Child. They started calling it the Bird and the Baby. So you're going to go buy the Bird and Baby later. So you can still go visit Eagle and Child. It's still around today. There, and I should mention this: if you ever go to England, there are so many of these locations that are on Tolkien tours, and you can actually, go to see a lot of these sort of mythological places that aren't really myths, but they sort of take on these mythological proportions in the world. And I'd love to go to see a lot of these places, but we all know that travel is expensive, right? So Tuesday mornings, we're going to go to the Bird and Baby. Thursday nights, we're going to go to Lewis's sitting room. Lewis had some rooms at Magdalen College, and that would be a lot of drinking, a lot of smoking, and a lot of reading. But at any given Inklings meeting, you are likely to find them drinking, singing, smoking, reading, generally talking about literature and all sorts of things that were academic in nature. But these were sort of Tolkien's backbone, right? And a lot of the people that were in this group were the first people that ever heard stuff from The Hobbit, or ever heard stuff from Lord of the Rings, or ever heard stuff that would go on to be published in the Silmarillion, or stuff like Farmer Giles, or any of the other writings that he did, that Tolkien wrote. This was the place where everything stopped first. And these men were incredibly important to shaping Tolkien's writing style. They didn't always give him the response that he wanted, and they were good enough friends that he could receive critique from them and not immediately sort of spiral into a depression. But they're also going to offer him encouragement, because he very frequently finds himself uninspired, or he feels like he's bitten off more than he can chew, especially during the process of writing Lord of the Rings, which takes him from about 1937, 1936, all the way through 1954 to write. It's a long process. Of course, it's a long book, right? It's over 1,000 pages. But the people that were going to be there are going to be the Inklings. And the group does end up growing over time. In 1939, they add Charles Williams. Williams was actually one of the editors at Oxford Press. So if you ever wanted somebody that could... I take that back. He worked at Oxford Press. But if you wanted somebody that knew about books and how to publish things and how to get stuff to print, this was a good addition to have. And in 1946, or 45-ish, when Christopher Tolkien, this is Ronald's third son, ends up going to Oxford, Christopher starts meeting with the Inklings as well. And I'm not trying to say that Ronald didn't love John and didn't love Michael. But he really, really felt an affinity with his third son, Christopher. Christopher, of course, Christopher Tolkien is named after Christopher Wiseman. This is the friend from the TCVSs who Tolkien still communicated with by letter quite a bit. And when Christopher starts joining the Inklings, this is going to be the first step towards Christopher being the child that eventually takes over sort of the Tolkien estate, or the literary work that his father produced. And that is a position that Christopher held all the way through until not too long ago when he finally passed away. And I'm not saying that like, oh, he finally died. It's just he actually lived to be quite old. And the Inklings themselves, again, are inspirations. So we mentioned Treebeard, but the stuff that they wrote is also going to have big impacts on Tolkien. One of the earliest books in what we might call the fantasy genre is Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. And Edison was a sometimes member of the Inklings, but his book, The Worm Ouroboros, is one that Tolkien read, and it's got a lot of the same sort of themes. There are big bad guys with lots of history behind them. The biggest bad guy has a magic ring, and you can't necessarily get rid of him without the ring going away. And you have these adventures where the great lords go on these quests to try to find ways to beat the bad guy. It's an interesting book, and I really enjoyed it. So if you're interested in more fantasy and you want something that predates Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, check out The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. But of course, the writings of the other Inklings, of course, the most famous of those, other than the Tolkien books, are the Chronicles of Narnia series. And we all know, well, maybe we don't all know, but I think it's fairly well known that Tolkien and Lewis did not necessarily see eye to eye on writing styles. And Lewis wrote in a very different way than Tolkien did. Tolkien viewed his writing rather differently than Lewis viewed Lewis's writings, and Tolkien very frequently had a negative opinion of Lewis's writings. But that doesn't mean Lewis returned the favor. In fact, Lewis began to be rather well known as a book reviewer, and some of the earliest reviews for both The Hobbit and all 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings were written by our friend Lewis and gave Tolkien rather glowing reviews. So it's always interesting that while Tolkien was very sort of openly vocal about how much he disliked Narnia, Lewis was always very supportive of Tolkien's work. So that's really interesting. But of course, people don't get to live forever. And this is going to end up having an impact on Ronald as well. So by the time that she was 90, this is a picture from much younger in her life. This is Jane Suffield. This is one of Tolkien's aunts. Aunt Jane had always been a sort of a steady figure in Tolkien's world, and corresponded with him rather frequently. And one of the things that happened just before her death, she wrote Tolkien a letter and asked him why none of the poems about Tom Bombadil had been published. Tolkien was very frequently writing all sorts of things, and it's fair to say that as much of the stuff of his that was published when he was alive, there was probably more that wasn't published by the time that he passed away. And he shared this quite frequently with the Inklings, with his family members, and Aunt Jane had, gotten on in age, and she said, I want to read the Bombadil poems in published form before I go. And this was the spur that Tolkien needed, and now you can go read The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which is a collection of poems. So if you are interested in who Bombadil is, and you're in the group of people that are really excited about arguing about who Bombadil is, you should definitely read the poems in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. But the book came out, she actually did get to read it, and then she passed away not too long afterwards. But when Aunt Jane passed, this was going to be something that once again sort of struck Tolkien heavily, because this was the last one of his sort of big childhood influences that were still alive, and he started worrying a lot about Edith's health. Edith's health was not the best when she was older in her life, and especially by the 1960s, she had started having a lot of trouble, like moving around up and down stairs, moving around between floors, carrying a lot of stuff, and Tolkien started worrying about her quite a bit. But what really hit him was in 1963. 1963, C.S. Lewis passes away. And their friendship had not necessarily been as strong as it had been since about 1957, mostly because when Jack told Lewis that he was going to get married, I'm sorry, I said that backward. Jack told Lewis. When Lewis told Tolkien that Lewis was going to get married, Tolkien made it rather clear that he didn't necessarily like the woman that Lewis had been seeing. And that was fairly evident. And that did put some strain on their friendship. But they had managed to patch things back up. And by November of 63, when Lewis died, this was another one of these big blows to him. And at that point, his last really big friend was Edith. And he decides that he needs to focus more on her. And he ends up retiring from Oxford, and even then moves away. Even after retirement, the university was going to give him some place to stay, nearby the university. But the house that they were going to put him in wasn't one that Edith could navigate very well. So he gave it up and moved out to the country to try to spend as much time as he could with his wife towards the end of their life. And this also had the benefit of bringing him a little bit further out of the limelight. He had been very popular by this point. Of course, by this period of time, the Lord of the Rings had sold millions of copies worldwide. But it's easy to just say that he ran away to get out of the spotlight because he didn't really like the spotlight. But it's also very important for us to understand that he did this with a conscious thought towards making sure that his wife's life and the end of her life was as easy as he could make it for her. And when she dies in 1971, it really turns his world upside down. He doesn't really know how to handle this. It takes him a long time to sort of get over the concept and to process all of this stuff. And what's really telling is that on her gravestone, he has Edith, Tolkien, and then the date, but then it just says Luthien. And if you're familiar with the story of Beren and Luthien, Luthien was the original sort of princess, this fairy princess that Tolkien had worked with, but the inspiration for that was Edith. And at a particular period of time where he was recovering, he was able to go see Edith on the weekends, and watching Edith dance in this little grove of trees was the original inspiration for the concept of Luthien. So if you know the story of Beren and Luthien, it's the story of a man who loves something that is way out of his reach, right? Luthien was the most beautiful elf in the entire world, and everybody recognized this. And here is a human, not an elf, that demands her love. And they fall in love immediately, and then Beren has to go fight off these massive amounts of threat to try to win her. What's interesting here is that there's a figure of authority that keeps them apart for a little while. because Luthien's father forbids their marriage. Could this be Father Francis forbidding Edith and Ronald from dating, perhaps? But they end up together forever. And what's really interesting in the story, and this is spoilers if you haven't read the Silmarillion, but Luthien is instrumental in getting Beren brought back to life. So when the story fleshes out the way that it does, if we're going to take the analogy, this would basically mean that, Ronald sort of thought that Luthien brought him back to life. Sorry, not Luthien, Edith, who was Luthien. Now, I know that's a very heavy dip into allegory, and we all know that Tolkien was not a big fan of allegory, but it's also fairly clear to say here that inspiration goes into the pot. And even if you're not trying to write an allegory, sometimes there might be some that kind of get mixed in. But in 71, when Edith dies, Tolkien is in a bad state, and he does end up moving back to Oxford to try to be closer to some of the friends that he had around there. But he then ends up going back to his most original friend, Hilary, his brother. And for the last couple of years of Tolkien's life, he spends a lot of time with his original friend. And what's really ironic is that this is about the only time in Tolkien's life where it seems like he spent any amount of time watching television, because Hilary had a TV and they would watch TV together. But to sort of put one last little nod about how important friends were to Tolkien, we have to talk about 1973. 1973, Tolkien was invited to a birthday party that was quite some distance away, but he decided to go, even though he didn't necessarily feel particularly well. And at the birthday party, he did not feel very well at all. And it wasn't 2 days later that he ended up passing away. He had some fairly severe stomach issues and ended up dying there in the city where his friends lived. And of course, anytime people pass away, we can sort of mourn their passing. But the story here is that he died with his friends, right? And even though he didn't feel that great, he still went to see his friends. And I think that's important, because people and the connections that he made with people were really, really important in his life. And if we look at the entire span of Tolkien's world, what we keep running into is that he really needed somebody to be there for him, and he really benefited from having these people in his lives. And it's very clear and very obvious to me that he would not have been the writer that he was, and he would not have written what he did without the influence of these really, really important people that gave him inspiration and gave him encouragement and pushed him in the right direction and supported him and tried to foster what they saw in him, right? So Tolkien was a friend among friends. And this is, again, not necessarily something that comes across all the time if you read a lot of accounts. He's a genuine guy. He's a quiet old gentleman. He's very reserved. He's very proper sometimes. But he was also a convivial fellow that really enjoyed a good time, sitting around with friends and chatting and just enjoying life, right? So that is going to wrap up part 2 of parts 1 through 4. So we'll come back the next 2 nights and pick up the other 2 parts. But before we head out, let's check out whether or not we have any questions.